last few months, the meta in Rise of Kingdoms has changed more than people probably expected ever since the introduction of Ragnar Prime, Philip II, and King Arthur. So today I'm going to update you guys on what I think the best 3, 5, and 7 army lineups are in Rise of Kingdoms. And I can't believe it's been since May of 2024 that I've done this video. But first, what's going on, guys? Cheers. Now, as you guys know, I am a partnered creator with Rise of Kingdoms, which means they support a few videos on the channel every single month, just like this one. But the most important support comes from you guys dropping a thumbs up and subscribing down below. Also super important, use the timestamps down below to jump to the part of the video that you care the most about. All right, now let's jump right into the tier maker here, and I think it's most logical to start with the best 3 army lineup in Rise of Kingdoms, because a lot of you guys, if you are new players or free-to-play players, you might not have the equipment or armaments or even the commander sculptures to run 4 or 5 or more armies, and so this is the best place to start. And just like has been the case for the past few years, I do think that the best 3 army lineup consists of 1 infantry, 1 cavalry, and 1 archer march. Starting off with cavalry, the single best cavalry army in the game, in my opinion, is Huo primary with King Arthur secondary. This is for a few reasons. First of all, Huo hits like a truck, and also at the beginning of battles has a lower rage requirement. On top of that, you have a ton of attack and defense from Huo, and then you get even more attack from King Arthur with a respectable 20% health bonus as well. Both of these commanders have some march speed, and of course the AoE skill damage on King Arthur is absolutely insane. Now, I know I'm going to get comments down below asking me this question, so I'm just going to answer it now, and that is, if I already have Nevsky and I already have Arthur, should I get the Huo? And I think the answer is probably no. I think if you have Nevsky Arthur, that pairing is perfectly fine. Lots of players have been using this and finding it very effective in the open field. I personally prefer the Huo as the primary these days. Not to say that Nevsky is bad, and we'll probably talk about him a little later in the video, but I just want to clear that up because I know a lot of people still have Nevsky and they're wondering if the Nevsky to Huo upgrade is worth it. I would say probably hold off, especially if you're only a 3 army player. With that being said, let's move on to archers, and I think the single best archer pairing in Rise of Kingdoms right now is still the Zhuge Liang with Hermann Prime. Now, this pairing is interesting because we did see the release of Shajar. She didn't really move the needle too much, and there are some new things you can do with archers that include Philip, of course, but I think if we're only building 1 archer march, this is definitely the best one because you have the double AoE on both the circular AoE for Zhuge Liang and the 3 target AoE with poison debuff on Hermann Prime. You also have an instant proc defense reduction on Hermann Prime. You also have the 4th skill on Zhuge Liang dealing more AoE damage. There's so much to love about this commander pairing. One thing I will note though is that you probably want to get the iconic tier 5 boots as soon as you can, and that applies to all archer marches, but especially this one because Zhuge Liang has no march speed himself. He is purely relying on the march speed from Hermann Prime, which is nice, but it isn't as great as other pairings we're going to talk about in this video. And so all archer players, that should be sort of their priority, is getting those boots to iconic 5. And then finally, as I mentioned before, is infantry. Now, infantry have a couple of different choices, okay? And this is also, I want to let you guys know, I'm posting this video in the middle of February, and in April I suspect we will see new infantry commanders, which is crazy to think about because we did just get Ragnar Prime at the end of 2024, and we have William Wallace from the middle of 2024. I feel like infantry are in a great spot right now, but the truth is that they are technically quote unquote up next for the next release for commanders, and so this is the one that might change the most in the next couple of months, so keep that in mind. But right now, at the time of recording this video, I think infantry have a few different choices. First of all, if you're running the Liu Che with Alexander the Great, I think you're done. You're golden. This is perfect. Both these commanders should be expertised, and you definitely want to have the relic upgrades on Alexander the Great. That really gives you a little bit more tankiness because Alex himself is relatively squishy, and there's not that much that Liu Che himself can do about that, and so getting the extra bonus tankiness from the museum relic is very, very good here. Definitely you need that for this pairing. But if you don't have the Alexander the Great, or if you don't like running the Alexander the Great because this is more of a micromanaging march, and by that I mean it really relies on the AoE from Liu Che and the instant proc from Alexander the Great and the combo attacks on the expertise from Liu Che, okay? This is a commander pairing that really thrives by going in and out of combat very quickly, which will require paying close attention to your field's location and making sure that you're managing that march effectively. And some players find that very difficult for a variety of reasons. Either 1, they're just not used to playing very quickly like that, or 2, they don't have a great connection, whether it's their cell service or their Wi-Fi or whatever the case might be. They might have an older device device, an older phone, tablet, or computer that they're playing on, and that makes the game run a little bit slower. And so there's a lot of different reasons why players might find this commander pairing a little bit harder to use than others. But if you're running, you know, a good PC, hardwired connection, and everything is good, then this is one of the easiest commander pairings to run. I know that might be a little bit confusing, but as long as you have the ability to micromanage this march with good network and PC connections, it's gonna be the easiest march to use. Okay, so it really depends on your personal situation, where you find yourself, and whether you're using PC or if you're using a mobile device. That being said, you know, a lot of players love this pairing, but some people don't like it for whatever reason that I just mentioned before. If you don't like this commander pairing, the easiest thing that you could do would be to run something like this, Liu Che with William Wallace. And I prefer the Liu Che primary because I do prefer to have the active skill of Liu Che go off every time my rage bar gets to 100%. And that, by that I mean, if you're going in and out of combat, sometimes you're going to hit with one active skill of your primary, and you may have to retreat for whatever reason before the secondary goes off, whether you're too deep in enemy territory, you're being targeted, or maybe the enemy is disappeared, and so like you didn't get, you know, they jumped into a node, or they jumped into their city, or whatever the case might be. There's going to be some instances where you don't cast the active skill of your secondary, or at least you cast it a little bit later. And what I want for my marches is I want that first hit to be super powerful, and if it can be AoE, I'd like it to be AoE. Now of course, in the case of, you might be looking at this pairing and saying, well, Omniarch, you're a hypocrite, and that's because you can't really run the Huo as the secondary here, and we will talk about King Arthur as primary later in the video, but ultimately I prefer this setup here. I know a lot of people like the smite tree, and if you want to do that, that's fine. You can do the William Wallace as the primary, that's okay. But for me personally, my personal preference is having AoE in the primary commander if you can, and if it makes sense. And honestly, the attack tree on Liu Che isn't horrible, right? Especially for smite damage, and so I feel like that it's a decent tree. You can make it work, and because of that, I like Liu Che as the primary. So this is my second sort of choice for infantry if you don't like the micromanaging. And finally, I know this is weird that we're coming up with 3 here, but I think it's also worth noting that we should be talking about Philip here as well. I think a lot of players are using the Liu Che with Philip because, you know, they have waited, they didn't go back and get the Alexander the Great because it's a season 2 commander. They were worried that he wouldn't age very well, and so instead they've been holding off, and they discovered that you actually can sort of do the same thing with Philip as you've been doing with Alexander the Great, right? You have a 3 target instant proc AoE from Philip, and it has a nice rage reduction. It's very supportive on the active skill. It gives you a bunch of defense and march speed, which you really like for infantry. So all in all, I would say the Liu Che Philip is probably just as good as the Liu Che Alex, if, you know, all else things considered. I will say though that the march speed on Alex is superior than the march speed on Philip, and so for me, I'm always going to prefer that march speed. I'm always going to prefer moving faster in the open field, and so that's what I'm going to do. Also, there's other uses for Philip if you have them, so keep that in mind. But I do just want to mention here that for the best 3, you know, army lineup here, if you're going to be running infantry, it's either going to be Liu Che Philip, Liu Che Alex, or Liu Che with William Wallace. You have 3 choices. My personal choice is going to be Liu Che Alex, so that's what I'm going to leave on the screen, and that is going to round out the best 3 marches in Rise of Kingdoms in my opinion. If you're only running 3 marches, this is probably the way that I would tell you to do it right now in February of 2025. Hello, Omniarch from the future here. I noticed this when I was editing. I do just want to say one last quick thing, because I know people are going to ask this in the comment section below, and that is, if you're still running the CPO with Liu Che, should you change it? And I think the answer right now at the time recording this is no. Same thing if you're running the Ragnar with Liu Che, should you change that? No, I think this is perfectly fine. The reason that you should not change it right now at the time of recording this is because, as I said before, in April, I suspect, again, this is I'm guessing here, but based on historical trends, we can expect the next release for Rise of Kingdoms to be infantry commanders, right? And in that scenario, we're in this weird spot where it's like, we don't know what that commander is going to be. One of the commanders is probably going to be good for the open field, and it might be great with Ragnar, it might be great with Liu Che. We don't know what that's going to be, and so right now I think the CPO Liu Che is still very good. It still pops off. It's double AoE. It's insane, right? It's very powerful, and so if you've been running this, do not feel the need to change that. Okay, it's a great march. I just think that right now, you know, don't make any other investments if you're right here, because we might be changing the infantry meta in the next couple of months, and I don't want you to invest in, you know, Alexander the Great right now, and then something insane comes out in a few months and then you hate me, right? So if you're running this, that is just fine as well. Now, as you build out more armies, you're going to have a 4 and 5 army lineup, and in my opinion, if you're going to be running 4 armies, and I know most players they don't really consider the 4 army lineup because it's sort of a transition phase, right, as you get to 5 armies. So really, you know, the 4 army lineup isn't something that is super prominent, but I'll touch on it here for just a moment. Okay, you of course have 2 different routes you can take for 4 army lineup. You either can do 2 cavs, 1 infantry and 1 archer, or you could do 2 infantry, 1 cav, 1 archer. That's kind of how I'm looking at it right now. I don't see a great scenario for 2 archers in my opinion. I personally only run 1 archer march as well, and we will talk about ways that you can run multiple archer marches later in the video, but for me personally, I think it is right now the hardest troop type to use effectively on average. Okay, not to say, again, that's on average, not to say that, you know, pairings like this don't do well, but that being said, I think if you're going to run 4 armies, if you wanted to do the infantry route, you would go something like this, where you either have the CPO as secondary to Ragnar Prime. This is an insanely good march. You've got a little bit of march speed on both, mainly on the CPO Prime here. You also have a really nice distribution of stats. They're both a double AoE commander pairing here. You have a debuff on the active skill from CPO Prime. You've got a little bit of sort of a vampire effect from stats on the Ragnar Prime as well. So all in all, super good. This is basically like the infantry version of Zhuge Liang Herman, right? It's very similar in the way that you're going to be getting those kills, although you do have an instant proc on the CPO Prime as well, so that is worth noting. If you don't have CPO Prime but you did for whatever reason grab Philip, I think this is a great place to put Philip as well. I think that Philip gives the march speed that you need for the Ragnar Prime, and he gives you some instant proc, which is really nice in today's current meta. You get a lot of bonus damage there, and I really like that a lot. But for me personally, I would recommend probably running it like this. I think honestly this is the best 4 army lineup in Rise of Kingdoms right now. I know that, again, not many people are running only 4, but that is my personal opinion. If you wanted to do the 2 cavalry route, then what I would recommend that you do is the safe route here for cavalry would be to run 2 skill damage armies here and just go the tried and true, you know, single target primary with the debuff and the AoE secondary, right? And honestly, whichever of these 2 armies has the Arthur secondary is probably going to be the one that performs better. If you wanted to spread things out and make them a little bit more even, I would say you would go with this, right? Because Nevsky, I think right now, because he's a little bit faster and because his active skill deals a little bit less damage, he often finds himself in you know, the worst position, right, in the field. Like, just in general, he's going to fan out first of all your different armies. We'll talk about that maybe in another video, but he's going to fan out first because he's going to hit the target first most likely, and he also has the lowest active skill damage shot out of pretty much any commander we're going to talk about in this video, just spoiler alert. And so because of that, you know, you can have King Arthur to kind of boost him up, and also the 4th skill on Nevsky gives a ton of skill damage to your secondary, which King Arthur is going to love. Also, the Huo Joan is tried and true. It's worked really well, right? So this is a great option you can go. But if you're, you know, let's say you have one really good cavalry set of gear and armaments and the second set is just okay, like it's usable but it's not great, then you might want to min-max that and actually just stack all your best stuff on the Huo Arthur and then just run the Nevsky Joan as the, you know, as your sort of backup secondary cav march, and that would be the way to go. So that's your best 4 army lineup if you wanted to do 2 calves. Personally, I would say probably go the infantry route, honestly, but this is another setup you could go if you really prefer cavalry as a player. With that being said, let's talk about the best 5 army lineup here in Rise of Kingdoms. I know this is what a lot of you guys have clicked on the video for because a lot of you guys are 5 army players. Right now, I personally think that running 2 infantry, 2 cavalry, and 1 archer is the way to go. Those 2 troop types seem to be dominating the open field meta right now, and that's for a variety of reasons. Of course, archers are a little bit slow right now. They're targeted heavily, and also their most recent release with Shajar felt a little bit more supportive rather than damage oriented. And that's not to say that players aren't using Shajar with good effect in the open field, but I feel like if you compare Shajar to some of the other things that we're talking about here, she just does not, it's almost night and day, right? I mean, look at Shajar and then look at Ragnar Prime, and then you look at Shajar and then you look at King Arthur, and it's like, what are we talking about here, right? It's pretty obvious that she is a cut below the rest. And so for that reason, I think I'm going to point you in the direction of 2 cav, 2 infantry, and 1 archer. Okay, and if you're going to go that route, then of course you're going to be doing some of the same things that we just talked about before, right? You're going to be doing the basically the best of both worlds here, where you're going to be doing the Ragnar Prime with CPO, you're going to be doing the Nevsky with the Joan, or again, you could swap these around depending on your gear and armaments and how you want to stack that, right? And I think this is going to be your best case scenario. Now, there are a couple of other things that you could do here if you wanted to. Again, if you don't like the micromanaging of the Alex March, then you could do something like this, and there you go. None of these marches require micromanaging, and you could just just face roll into things and pop off, and you'll be really happy about that. Additionally, you could do the Philip here as well. I think this is a perfectly reasonable, basically just as good as what we just talked about before. I think that's a reasonable route that you could go here if you wanted to. Now, the other thing that you could do if you really like micromanaging, and I think that this honestly is like the secret here, okay? And if you've made it this far into the video, I want you to drop down below your favorite star emoji, okay? Because you made it to the secret call out portion of the video, and this is for players that, again, you have a good computer setup, not playing on mobile, you're playing on PC, you've got a good connection, and you're good at micromanaging your marches. If that's the case, then for you, I would actually recommend running something like this, where you have 2 of your infantry marches are the micromanaging instant proc damage marches. I think that is probably the way to go. You can either do the Liu Che with Alex and the Ragnar with Philip, or you could go the other way around. Honestly, I'm torn between these two. I feel like a lot of players run it like this, but personally I feel like if you wanted to sort of spread out the march speed a little bit more evenly, you would do something like this, right? Because Liu Che gives you 20%, Ragnar gives you 10%, but you get 20% from Philip and 30% from Alexander the Great, right? And so 30 plus 10 is 40, 20 plus 20 is 40, and so these would be just as fast as one another. That's kind of how I'm looking at this personally, and that's why I would run it in this way. It also spreads out the infantry defense a little bit better because you have 40% on Ragnar Prime, which is just insane, and then you get 20% from the Alex relic plus a little bit whenever he has a shield. And so let's just call that like 65 or 67% in infantry defense, and then here we have 20% defense on the Liu Che and 35% defense on the Philip, right? And so right out of the gate it's 55%, which is quite nice. And that is, again, it's a little bit more well-rounded in this way, but if you wanted just the fastest, heaviest hitting in one march and then the sort of slightly slower but still respectable, you could go this way as well. It's really up to you. But this is like, if you're really cooking with gas, I would say going with one of these routes is probably the best way to go for the double infantry, because again, you have 2 micromanaging marches. Now, the next setup that you could do here is if you wanted to use your Philip as a cavalry march, what you would do is then you would bench the Nevsky and you would actually do the Arthur primary and the Philip secondary, and then you would run the Huo Joan as you may have already been doing. And then in this way, again, you have 2 pairings right here that are sort of micromanaging marches. And I've explained this in previous videos, but the Arthur Philip combo as a sort of micromanaging march is effectively a cavalry version of your Liu Che Alex, right? So if you found success with Liu Che Alex, you will likely find success with the King Arthur Philip. Now, there is a difference though, and let me be very clear here. First of all, this army is going to hit harder, but it is more squishy. So it's definitely a trade-off. And so again, you have to be very good with micromanaging because you cannot be out of position here, okay? It's going to hit like a truck, but if you are out of position for a second, you're done, okay? So keep that in mind. A lot of players might not like that style of play. They may not find that they can do that, right? So keep that in mind. But if you can do that, I think you're going to find great success with this pairing right here, this 5 army lineup. And also when it comes to the King Arthur as the primary, you might be asking me about armaments and inscriptions, and I would say that you do not need the Delta formation to run this. You can run the arch formation. If you've been opening arch formation chests for your Liu Che or your William Wallace or whatever, then you're probably going to be getting a couple of decent cavalry pieces that you can use as armaments for your King Arthur. Now, it is better to have the Delta formation. It's better to have things like butterfly and just really go all in on that combo damage, but you don't need it, okay? Now, with that being said, if you don't have any good arch cavalry pieces for your armaments, then obviously this goes out the window, right? You're not going to be doing this. You're going to be running the Philip probably with one of your infantry pairs, and you're going to be running something like this, okay? So again, this is really going to come down to your personal account. Do you have any armaments for either the arch or Delta formation that you could run for King Arthur primary? If yes, you could try it. If not, just use him as secondary, and he's going to be better that way. Don't force it, right? Again, I'm telling you that this is a more squishy version of Liu Che Alex, and so you do need the stats, you do need the armaments to make this work, okay? So don't try it just because you saw it in this video and then you realize your armaments suck, and then you're gonna blame me because you got wrecked, okay? So keep that in mind. But that is another way that you can run things, and that is that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna leave these here. These are a couple of different alternatives that you could do if you wanted to. Of course, this could go here, it depends either way, but those are going to be some of the best commander pairs that you can run for a 5 army lineup. And with that out of the way, we're going to jump to a 7 army lineup. And I know some of you might be running 6, but it's very few of you. I think there's even fewer 6 army lineup players than there are 7 army lineup players. And if you are a 6 army lineup lineup player, you probably know what you're doing. Okay, so for 7 armies, most likely you're going to be running the 2-2-2 setup. Okay, so 2 Cavs, 2 infantry, 2 archers, and then the final march, the 7th march, has a couple of different routes. You can either do an additional infantry, an additional archer, an additional cavalry, or, you know, one of those, or you could do a open field leadership support march, or you could do a ranged march. Okay, and for this video, what I'm going to suggest is, you know, if you liked ranged gameplay, then that might be a route that you can go. I would say if you're going to run, you know, first of all, let's cover the 2 archers, and I'm going to go with something along these lines, right? I think that the Ashurbanipal with YSG is a decent commander pairing. This functions very similar to the Zhuge Liang with Hermann Prime in that they are both big AoE damage. That is like how archers can compete in the field right now. The downside of this is it feels slower and it's squishy, right? It's more squishy, and so, you know, you're running that risk. If you don't like the squishiness of this pairing, then what you could do is something with Shajar, right? You could do Shajar with YSG. That's another route that you could go, and this is, you know, effectively the same thing as running a Huo primary, right? Huo primary just hits one target like a truck. You're getting the same thing here from the Shajar primary, except you're running archers, right? And so she gives you a lot of health, she gives you some march speed, and I think that you could run this pretty effectively, and that might be the best way to go for you. I personally think the high risk high reward from Ashurbanipal is better because it is a 5 target AoE in the primary, and I've talked about in this video how much I like to have the active skill be AoE, right? That's another benefit of running the King Arthur as primary with the Philip, is that you do get another AoE on the primary, right? Which is really nice stuff, and that would make Huo the only one that doesn't, and that's fine because you have the double cast on the Joan, which is really good. But all in all, though, these are different routes that you could take. Another route that you could take is, and I've seen this from other players, I guess technically I am giving you 6 army lineups now that I think about it. Another route that you could go would be something like this, right? Or if you really wanted to, you could do the Ashurbanipal with the Hermann. It really depends. Honestly, I know that a lot of people have gotten some good effect using the Philip behind the Zhuge Liang for a couple of different reasons. 1, he gives you the march speed. 2, he gives you even more health, which is insane. Okay, he also gives you the instant proc damage, and so all in all, I think this is a really solid army. You also have the ability to potentially cast your Zhuge Liang active skill again with Philip, which is, you know, really the expertise on Philip looks really good on paper. It doesn't pop as much as you would expect, but when it does, having it pop for Zhuge Liang is great because he is that 5 target AoE commander, right? So if you went that route, I would probably point you in this direction as far as, you know, if you were going to use him as a archer march, you could do that, or you could just do the tried and true, keep Zhuge Liang Hermann the same and run the Philip with the Ashurbanipal. I know some people like that combination because when you cast the active skill from Ashurbanipal, he gets the expertise randomized stats, right? And so there's some synergy there, but again, the active skill, you know, extra casting from Philip isn't going to happen as much as you think, and so this synergy is good. It's definitely there, but I wouldn't say it's great, right? So you could either run one of these two. It's up to you, however you prefer it. Of course, YSG ends up in that mix as well. So with that being said, I'm going to leave it just like this. I think that you're probably going to run something along those lines if you're running 6, and then the question becomes who becomes the 7th, right? And again, if you are okay with ranged gameplay, then I would say just do the ranged as the 7th march and you're popping off, right? You don't even have to think about it. If you have the ranged gear, you've made the investment in ranged, and you have the commanders, you could just set it there, just set it behind the murder ball and just farm kills. It farms kills a little bit slower, but your trades are going to be pretty good as long as you can micromanage that march, right? And that's another thing. It's another march you have to micromanage. Some people like that gameplay, some people don't, so just keep that in mind. Also, in a recent face-to-face with the developers, they sort of hinted at keeping a close eye on ranged, and so for me, I don't know, I personally am still holding off on ranged. I've not been convinced yet to go all in on ranged, and if they're paying a close attention to the performance of ranged, then that could mean, you know, honestly, I don't think they're going to nerf ranged. I do not think they're going to nerf ranged because players have already spent a lot of time, effort, gems, everything investing in range, and so it would feel really bad if they nerfed it, and in fact, I don't want them to nerf ranged, right? Even as somebody who does not love range gameplay, they should not do that. Okay, so let me be very clear there. But if they find that players are getting too good of reports, or if they're finding that, you know, range are becoming more prominent than they expected or wanted for the overall flow of the gameplay, then they could be potentially power creeping the other troop types and sort of leaving ranged a little bit in the dust, right? And we saw that with the most recent range releases. We had John Hyundai and whoever the other dude was, Stefan the Third, right? I think those guys were a little bit, people didn't love that, right? And so, you know, I think that's kind of almost evidence in itself. But if you have the investment in ranged and you like using ranged, this is the 7 army lineup that I would recommend that you go with that being said, if you don't like the ranged commanders, or you don't have the investment in them and you think that, you know, maybe the investment in them won't be great in the long run, then what you could do for your 7th March is you could do something that is a little bit more open field leadership support route. And if you went that route, then you would probably be looking at something like either the Philip with somebody like Trajan. Where's Trajan at? Where's my boy Trage? There he is. Philip with Trajan, right? You'd run something like this as your 7th army lineup, as just a pure support march. Maybe you throw the Korok's war drums on it, right? And you're just there to purely support everybody else in the open field. And that would be your 7 army lineup right there, right? That you're one and done, you're good to go. And that's pretty much it, right? The downside of this route is that you do need leadership gear, right? And I think a lot of players do not have leadership gear. So, you know, if you do not have leadership gear, then that's pretty much it. You can't really run this pairing. If you don't have the Trajan, you could also run a Shajar here. I think that is perfectly fine. Once again, you do need the leadership gear to do this though. I think the Shajar secondary here is great, again, as a supportive march. Okay, now let's go over a couple of different options. If you want to run 7 armies but you don't have the leadership or the range stuff, you just want to run 3 of one troop type and 2 of the other troop types, this is where we're going to go over that part of the video. These are known as 3-2-2 lineups for obvious reasons, and I think that right now probably the best 3 army lineup is probably going to be infantry, in my opinion. And the reason for that is a combination of all of the things that we've already talked about with regards to the instant proc meta of Alex and Philip, while simultaneously still being able to run the Guan CPO. Now, I know that a lot of people feel like Guan CPO is a very old army, and I will say that in general it is, right? I mean, if you were going to run something like this, you know, the Guan CPO of all these armies, it's probably going to be closer to the Ashurbanipal YSG than anything else. But I do honestly feel like Guan CPO probably will outperform the Ashurbanipal YSG, and if it doesn't, at least you know that the silence on Guan Yu is going to devastate the enemy. And that's because a lot of rage manipulation is happening right now in the current meta. A lot of people are talking about horns and war drums, and if you should be running multiple war drums in your 7 army lineup, right? A lot of players are doing that for the pure rage regeneration, and Guan Yu, a single Guan Yu can stop 3 armies in his tracks with one swoop of his AoE, right? And so that is a really great debuff to have in your 7 army lineup. And I think honestly with his relic, I mean, it gives him a slight bump. It's not, you know, a game changer, but it is nice. I noticed the difference when I first got my museum relic upgrade. I felt like he was pretty good. He's got attack, he's got march speed, he's got a 3 target AoE, he's got the silence, and he's got bonus damage on the 4th skill. It's just a generic open field commander that works really well, and he's tried and true with CPO. Of course, then you would have to go the route of running the instant proc commanders here on this lineup, right? And you know, again, if you don't love the Alex, then of course you could do something like this, and you'd be pretty happy with that, I think. And that's pretty much how you're going to run the 7 army lineup with 3 infantry, in my opinion. But honestly, I am leaning more towards the instant proc meta right now. That's me personally. I am in an A seed kingdom, and we do often go up against really strong kingdoms, so that's been my, you know, anecdotal experience here. Again, do not go for the high micromanaging marches if you don't have a good computer, if you're running on mobile, if you have a poor internet connection, whatever. It's going to be much harder for you to run these armies, and I think that is a big part of the reason why some players, you know, find these armies to be god tier and other players find them to be awful. It's because there's some discrepancies in your play style and your setup and things like that. So keep that in mind. But right now, like, honestly, if you were to ask me, I would say this is probably the best 7 army lineup in the game right now. The only sort of exception that I might make would be something along the lines of maybe throwing a Belisarius Prime in here somewhere, possibly taking out the Nevsky and doing something like this or like this. It really just depends on how you want to run these things. You could run something like that as well as a 7 army player, because obviously the expertise on Belisarius Prime, the value of his expertise goes way up as you end up being one of those loyal players who's swarming things down. But ultimately, if you don't have him for whatever reason, then you could just do this. And I think honestly this is probably very close, if not the best 7 army lineup in Rise of Kingdoms right now, without ranged, without leadership. And even if you factor those things in, you might be able to make the argument like surely the ranged, you know, if you ran a ranged march, would outperform the Guan CPO. I think on average over the course of a KVK, probably, right? Especially if you're doing things like alders and things like that. But if you're running a murder ball and you want to be in that murder ball, I think this is probably going to outperform. So it's really a situation situational, right? There's going to be some situations where you would rather have the ranged march as the 7th. There's going to be some situations where you'd rather run the Guan Scipio, but all in all, if you don't have the range, just run the 7 and you're good to go. Again, the Shajar might be in here somewhere. There's a couple of different swaps you could make if you really wanted to, but that's how I'm thinking of the meta right now. With that being said, let's assume that you do not want to run 3 infantry and instead you want to run 3 cavalry, which I think it would be the second best play that you could run here. Then of course we are talking about splitting up the Huo Philip, running the King Arthur with Philip here, as I mentioned previously, running the Huo with Joan, and then that leaves you with a couple of choices for your Nevsky. Of course you could run the Nevsky Joan and that would be fine. I think if you did that, then you would be looking at Belisarius Prime, like I mentioned before, and you're either going to put the Belisarius Prime behind your Huo or you're going to put it behind your Nevsky. Either one is fine. Again, the army that has the Joan of Arc Prime here is going to outperform most likely, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And so either way, I think this is the way that you can run it. I think if you're still using the William at this point as a 7 army player, I think you can. I know that, you know, he is supportive, he gives you rage, and like I said, there is so much rage manipulation happening in the game right now that I can understand why you might want to run this. And so if you did, then there you go, you could run one of these two options. I personally find that the Huo Joan for me in the past 2 KVKs has been outperforming my Nevsky Joan. That's just my anecdotal experience. I know some players have felt that way. Some players think Nevsky Joan is tried and true and they want to keep it, and that's totally fine. So if you want to run one of those, that's fine as well. I personally think that, you know, you might want to consider running the Belisarius Prime here, and then you would be good to go. The other thing that you could do would be something like this, where you actually just bench the Nevsky completely, right? And this would give you a couple of things. Again, if you look at this lineup here, every single primary commander is AoE except for the Huo, right? But he hits like a truck, and this is going to give you the benefit of the expertise on Belisarius Prime. It's also going to give you the supportive nature of the William plus his AoE, and it gives you the micromanaging, you know, AoE insanity that we have here for Arthur Philip. I think this is another 7 army lineup that you could run. I think that this is, I don't know, I feel like if you're gonna bench the Nevsky, you have to be like you have to really know what you're doing here, and you have to be able to rely on every single one of your allies being an insane Kraken just like you, so that way they get the most out of like the William buffs, for example, and everything's being swarmed down, right? I think this is a route that you could go. I'm just personally, for me, I'm a little bit less comfortable recommending this lineup. I think personally I would much rather see the Nevsky here somewhere, right? Whether it's like this or like this, I think you will be just fine. Honestly, I think I prefer this lineup specifically because it splits up. Like, we have a lot of defense on Belisarius Prime, which is nice. 30% attack, 25% defense. It's really solid. I feel like Huo already has a lot of defense himself, and so he benefits from the extra health here on Joan of Arc. But again, at this point, we're splitting hairs. Whoever has the Joan's going to perform better. Just accept that, and however you like, anecdotally, however you feel it performs better for you, whether it's like this or like this, just run that, and I think you're perfectly fine. Then we come to the 7 army lineup of archers, and I think, again, for me, this is probably the worst performing of the choices that we have here. You really have to have great equipment for a lot of this stuff, and in one instance you might just run something like this. Like, straight up, you could do this, or you could do something like this, right? And I think those would be great choices. If you go this route, obviously, then you don't need any real leadership gear. I mean, obviously best in slot for archers has some leadership gear if you know, crafted it more recently. If you went this route, then you would be looking at full leadership gear for the Philip, or at the very least you would have some archer gear talented for leadership, which is like very bizarre, and I probably wouldn't point you in that direction, but it's worth noting that this is one of the routes that you could go. Personally, I would probably recommend something like this. I think this is a little bit more reasonable and a little bit more stable in terms of spreading out the march speed across, you know, these 3 different armies, having some nice AoE on all the armies. You have the micromanaging instant proc here on your Zhuge Liang, which is quite good. Again, as I mentioned before, you could move the Philip down here to the Ashurbanipal if you really like the synergy that happens there with the expertise skills on these two. Again, I feel like you're going to find that the Philip pops less often than you think, but this is a route that you could go, or you could do something like this, whichever you prefer. Or if you wanted to get really freaky with it, you could do something like this, right? Where you have the Herman YSG to give YSG a little bit of the march speed. Then you have, you know, the same synergy we talked about before with the Ashurbanipal with Philip, and he gives you some march speed. And then the Zhuge Liang either goes with the Shajar, which I hate because her secondary is not going to be dealing a lot of damage, so you would want this. But then when you do that, it's just like, oh well, now your AoE's on the secondary for Shajar, is that worth it? So really, you could just do something like this, where you've got the Nebu, who gives you the march speed, also has an AoE, which is solid. He's a little bit older, so I don't love this setup here personally, but I did want to at least mention it because it's something that some players might consider. So all in all, I would say this is probably your safest route, something like this, depending on which march you want to micromanage. You could do this as well. I think that is perfectly fine, but that's going to do it for the 7 army lineup for archers. Again, I think that the archers are a little bit lagging behind. I think the Shajar really pulls down their lineup, unfortunately, and then they have to look far back to something like Nebu to really fill that void, which sucks. Anyway, guys, that's pretty much going to do it for today's video. If you really put a gun to my head and said, Omni, you must pick a single 7 army lineup to recommend, I would probably go with this one, although it's very close with the 7 army lineup that runs 3 cavalry. I think that one is also very, very close. I like the Belisarius debuff as well. And then in third place would be running a ranged march as your 7th, in my opinion. I think if you like that gameplay, that might even bump up to number 1, depending on how you prefer. I mean, it's a game after all, so however you have the most fun is actually what's most important, right? So never forget that. But I have a soft spot for Guan Yu, and I think the silence is going to be exceptionally good moving forward, unless maybe we get another silence commander coming down the pipeline, who knows. But as I said earlier, infantry, the next infantry commanders are coming, so right now might be the worst time to invest in commanders such as Ragnar Prime, Guan Yu, or Alexander the Great. I feel like these 3, you know, certainly Guan Yu is mostly out of the meta already, but Ragnar Prime and Alex would be like kind of next on the chopping block, in my opinion. As far as Ragnar Prime dealing more damage than CPO, that's true, but his debuff is really nice, and he has the march speed and a nice stat spread, so it's hard for me to recommend Ragnar like head and shoulders above CPO. It might be the case that Ragnar gets replaced instead, but now we're just going off into speculation land. So if you wanted the safest 7 army lineup right now, it would probably be the one with ranged. Second safest would be the 3 army lineup with calves. Third safest would be the 3 army lineup with infantry, in my opinion, just because I think it's a little bit better. But at this exact moment in time, as a snapshot, this is the one that I would pick if I had every commander in the world expertised and I wanted all of them to be part of the murder ball. With that being said, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, I would really appreciate it if you dropped a thumbs up on it. It helps out the channel a ton. It'll push this out into the algorithm so other Rise of Kingdoms players might see it. And while you're down there, consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell to be notified the next time I upload a Rise of Kingdoms video. And comment down below your thoughts on my 7 army lineup, my 5 army lineup, and 3 army lineup. What would you change? What do you think is the best? What have you found in your own anecdotal experience? Let me know in the comment section below. With that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching. This has been Omniarch. I will talk to you guys again soon. Peace.